General Franz Halder checks his watch in the pre-dawn darkness along the German-Russian border. It's 0315 hours on June 22nd, 1941. 75 minutes ago, he watched a Russian grain train chug across the River Bug at Brest-Litovsk, right on schedule. Business as usual between Berlin and Moscow. Trade agreements functioning perfectly. The Russians suspect nothing. Now, 7,000 German field guns sit aimed at targets across that border, loaded and ready. Overhead, Halder can hear the drone of 1,000 Luftwaffe bombers heading east-Yazist into the darkness. In 15 minutes, 3.5 million German soldiers will surge across the frontier in the largest invasion in human history. The Führer promised this campaign would be over in 5 months, before winter arrives. Halder believed him. 11 days from now, he'll write in his diary that the campaign against Russia was won in 14 days. He's catastrophically wrong. This invasion will become Hitler's greatest blunder, the decision that breaks the back of the German army, and the beginning of a nightmare that won't end until Soviet tanks are parked outside the Reichstag in Berlin. Halder doesn't know it yet, standing in the darkness listening to those bombers. But he's about to watch Napoleon's 1812 disaster repeated on an even more catastrophic scale. He's about to learn that kicking in a door sometimes gets you a boot to the face. The watch hands move forward. Minutes now. Halder thinks about the plan. 3 massive army groups. Army Group North pushing through the Baltic states to Leningrad. Army Group Center driving through Belorussia to Moscow. Army Group South sweeping through Ukraine. The Soviet Union will collapse, Hitler promised. The whole rotten structure will come crashing down. 5 months, maximum. Halder is a professional soldier. He knows military history. He knows what happened to Napoleon's Grand Army in Russia. Every German officer knows that story. But Hitler convinced them this time would be different. German armor is superior. German tactics are proven. The blitzkrieg that crushed Poland and France will work in Russia. The Soviets are disorganized, poorly led, their best generals executed in Stalin's purges. This will be easy. The first artillery piece fires, then another, then 7,000 guns open up simultaneously, and the eastern horizon lights up with muzzle flashes. The invasion has begun. April 1941. 2 months before Halder stood at that border, Nazi Germany was master of Europe. Poland conquered in weeks. Norway and Denmark occupied. France humiliated and defeated. The Low Countries overrun. Only Britain remained defiant, and Britain was alone, perilously vulnerable after defeats in France, Norway, Greece, and Crete. The tiny island nation had no means of meeting the powerful German army in battle. She could summon imperial reserves with time, but time was what Britain didn't have. Adolf Hitler had always admired the British Empire. He dreamed of a world where Germany controlled Europe while Britain controlled everything else. He still believed he could bring Churchill to the peace table. But Hitler suspected Britain was fighting on because she looked to the Soviet Union for eventual support. So he calculated that he could isolate Britain with a rapid war of movement in the East, toppling Stalin's regime and crushing Russian Bolshevism, which he loathed with ideological passion. An invasion of Western Russia would also provide Germany with Lebensraum, living space. This had been one of Hitler's aims from his earliest preaching, from the beer halls of Munich in the 1920s to the rallies at Nuremberg in the 1930s. The German people needed room to grow, and that room lay in the East. Less than a month after France surrendered in June 1940, while he was still considering an invasion of England, Hitler ordered his generals to draw up plans for an invasion of Russia in spring 1941. He revealed his intentions during a conference at his Berchtesgaden Alpine retreat on July 31, 1940. His military commanders listened in stunned silence as he outlined the operation. 120 divisions would thrust through the fertile Ukraine to the river Dnieper. The rest would advance through the Baltic states toward Moscow. The campaign would be completed in 5 months, Hitler estimated, before the onset of harsh Russian winter. This would be the blitzkrieg to end all blitzkriegs. With Russia struck down, Britain virtually impotent, and isolationist America unwilling to enter the war, his promised 1,000-year Reich was assured. On December 18, 1940, Directive No. 21 was issued, authorizing Operation Barbarossa. A war in the East was never a question for Hitler and his generals. The Führer was committed to a venture that would prove to be his biggest blunder of the war and bring about the undoing of his army. The Nazi leader chose to ignore the bitter lesson of Napoleon's army in Russia in 1812. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery would later observe, "One of the first rules of war is, don't march on Moscow." But in 1940, the Nazi dictator had no doubt that his army, the most powerful in the world, would overcome any resistance the Russians might muster. Hitler's contempt for Soviet military capability ran deep. In the 1920s, he'd said, "This colossal empire in the East is ripe for dissolution." In 1941, his assessment was even more dismissive. "We have only to kick in the door," he promised his generals, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." He told Halder, "When Barbarossa commences, the world will hold its breath and make no comment." The Führer's confidence was absolute, but he also warned that it would be a brutal undertaking with no quarter given. In March 1941, 3 months before the invasion, Hitler gathered his generals and told them something that should have given them pause. "The war against Russia will be such that it cannot be conducted in a knightly fashion. This struggle is one of ideologies and racial differences, and will have to be conducted with unprecedented, unmerciful, and unrelenting harshness." On the eve of the invasion, Hitler addressed the German High Command with fanatical certainty. "Your armies will shatter the Russian colossus. It will be a hard fight. The Asiatics are cruel and cunning, but you will meet them with a determination as hard and cold as ice. Only one people will come out of this alive, our people. You must make your troops put aside all their notions of restraint and humanity. This will be the last campaign of this war, and it will ensure the security of the Reich for many generations. We cannot refuse to give battle, and one day the world will thank us for having responded to the call of destiny." The invasion was delayed by late spring thaw and German campaigns in the Balkans. Finally, Operation Barbarossa launched early on Sunday, June 22, 1941. At 0200 hours, that Russian grain train hauled its cargo across the Bug River at Brest-Litovsk, one of many trains that had taken the route during past months under Berlin-Moscow trade agreements. Everything appeared normal. Stalin's regime saw no threat. 75 minutes later, over 7,000 German field guns of all calibers started bombarding pinpointed targets. Overhead droned 1,000 Luftwaffe bombers on their way to pound Soviet airfields, military installations, and communication centers. A key objective was destruction of the Red Air Force on the ground before Soviet pilots could even reach their aircraft. Then, German armor and infantry surged eastward across the frontier on a 500-mile front. The onslaught would eventually cover 2,000 miles from the North Cape to the Black Sea. The massive invasion force comprised 3 powerful army groups with almost 3.5 million men, 153 divisions, 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, 600,000 motorized vehicles, and 625,000 transport horses. Flying in support were 2,700 bombers, fighters, and dive bombers. Hitler monitored the opening closely, gleeful and supremely confident. "Before 3 months have passed," he promised that day, "we shall witness a collapse in Russia, the like of which has never been seen in history." Under overall command of Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, the 3 German army groups aimed for precise objectives. General Ritter von Lieb's Army Group North would advance from East Prussia through the Baltic states to Leningrad. General Fedor von Bock's Army Group Center would besiege Brest-Litovsk, swing north of the Pripyat marshes, and head for Minsk, Smolensk, and ultimately Moscow. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group South would advance from southern Poland along the Hungarian frontier and across Romania toward the vast plains of southern Russia and Ukraine. The German armies included 14 Finnish divisions, 14 Romanian, 4 Italian, 2 Slovak, plus a Spanish division and a Hungarian rapid corps. The Luftwaffe squadrons were supported by Finnish, Romanian, Italian, Hungarian, and Croatian fighters and bombers. This was a coalition invasion, though German forces dominated. Facing them in the western military districts were about 140 divisions and 40 brigades of Marshal Georgy Zhukov's Red Army, totaling an estimated 2.9 million men, 10 to 15,000 tanks, some obsolete, and 8,000 aircraft. Historian Alan Clark said, "What an appalling moment in time this is, the head-on crash of the two greatest armies, the two most absolute systems in the world. No battle in history compares with it. In terms of numbers of men, weight of ammunition, length of front, the desperate crescendo of fighting, there will never be another day like June 22nd, 1941. Moscow High Command was surprised by the scale of the Nazi assault. Despite repeated warnings of Hitler's intentions by Soviet agents and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Stalin was unable to grasp what was happening. He'd assumed the rumors of war were German saber-rattling, diplomatic pressure to extract better trade terms. The Soviet Union had been preparing for war, expanding the Red Army and producing innovative weapons like the deadly Katyusha rocket launcher and the 26-ton T-34 medium tank, arguably the best tank of World War II. But Stalin expected reconciliation with Hitler in 1941, not invasion. He was not ready for this. When the German juggernaut burst across his borders, the brutal Marshal Stalin refused to sanction retaliation at first. He was in a state of shock, almost complete mental collapse, for several days before pulling himself together. "Everything which Lenin created, we have lost forever," he groaned to his aides. His voice carried the weight of a man watching his world disintegrate. After recovering from his initial breakdown, Stalin operated cautiously in the first month of the war, still trying to understand how he'd miscalculated so catastrophically. Before we see how catastrophically Hitler miscalculated, I need to tell you what this channel is really about. Every single day, I bring you World War II stories that go beyond the battle maps and tactical analysis. These are stories about human beings making decisions with incomplete information, leaders whose confidence outran their competence, soldiers caught between impossible orders and impossible situations. Operation Barbarossa is one of history's greatest military disasters, but it's also a story about hubris, miscalculation, and the terrible price paid by millions of people for one man's blunder. If you want to understand not just what happened in World War II, but why it happened, what it felt like to the people living it, and what lessons it still teaches us today, hit that subscribe button. The story of what happened after Halder's confident prediction reveals something crucial about the gap between planning and reality, between confidence and truth. And where are you listening to this right now? Halder was standing on the German-Russian border about to launch the largest invasion in history, convinced it would be over in weeks. Now, this story of miscalculation and hubris reaches across 80-plus years to wherever you are. New York, Berlin, Moscow, Tokyo. Drop your city in the comments, because what happened next changed the entire course of World War II and shaped the world you're living in today. Back to June 22nd, 1941, and the door Hitler was about to kick. The specified aim of the German armies was to kill Russians rather than conquer cities. Hitler and his generals had agreed that Soviet forces had to be trapped and beaten in Western Russia, within 250 miles of the border. Their concern was that the Red Army might fall back deep into the Russian interior, drawing the Germans into a battle of attrition on the edge of Asia. The plan was encirclement, destruction, annihilation. The Luftwaffe achieved aerial supremacy within the first few days, catching most of the Red Air Force on the ground and destroying it before Soviet pilots could take off. Great German formations of panzers, artillery, and infantry steamrolled relentlessly into Western Russia in classic blitzkrieg fashion. The iron spearheads knifed through lightly defended frontier positions, and there seemed to be no stopping them. Bridges across the Bug and other rivers were seized by surprise. Sleepy Russian guards were machine-gunned as they scrambled for their weapons, many of them killed before they understood that war had begun. Where there were no bridges, German shock troops paddled silently across in rubber dinghies or rowed powered assault boats before the Russians could open fire. The initial German advantage was overwhelming. The Soviet defenders fought bravely, but suffered heavy defeats. On the road to Minsk and Smolensk, panzers of Army Group Center contemptuously blasted aside Russian armored cars and anti-tank guns. The German advance seemed unstoppable. Rundstedt's forces in the south made good though less easy headway, while on their southern flank the Germans suffered heavy casualties at the hands of Soviet infantrymen who fought with unexpected ferocity. On the distant northern front, where Germans pushed into Soviet-occupied Lithuania, they were halted temporarily by determined Mongolian troops who refused to break even when surrounded. On this northern front, General Erich von Manstein's Panzer Corps delivered its first devastating punch. Manstein believed Operation Barbarossa could only succeed if main Soviet military strength was destroyed in the first few weeks. He urged his tank groups forward without respite, driving his men mercilessly because he understood what was at stake. His spearhead thrust 40 miles deep into Russian territory in 34 hours. It was blitzkrieg at its most effective. But the Soviets fought back with desperate valor. They held a trump card the Germans hadn't reckoned on. As massed panzers rumbled toward distant Daugava, their left flank was suddenly menaced by monstrous 43-ton KV-1 and 52-ton KV-2 tanks of the crack 3rd Soviet Armored Corps. German tank crews had never seen anything like these behemoths. Their shells bounced off the KV tanks' armor like pebbles off castle walls. A furious two-day battle ensued. German tankers, used to armor superiority, suddenly found themselves outmatched. They could hit these Soviet monsters repeatedly without effect, while KV tank guns destroyed German panzers with single shots. The Germans prevailed only after calling in high-velocity 88 mm flak guns, the same weapons used against aircraft, now pressed into desperate service as tank killers. It was the first sign that German intelligence had underestimated Soviet military capability. The German advances were generally so rapid that towns and villages were overrun before hapless inhabitants knew war was in progress. Civilians woke to find German soldiers in their streets, tanks rumbling past their homes, the entire world transformed overnight. Bach's Army Group Center advanced 400 miles and captured the whole of Belorussia in 3 weeks. The Soviet armies lost almost 5,000 tanks, almost 10,000 field guns, and 1,700 planes. The seizures of Bialystok and Minsk were each reminiscent of the German victory over the French Army and British Expeditionary Force in May 1940. In Russia, the invaders sought to destroy the Red Army west of the Dnieper and Dvina rivers, preventing escape into the hinterland, and to capture Smolensk, the land bridge to the Soviet capital. All went well at first, though the great distances involved and minimal Russian infrastructure soon hampered the German timetable. Panzer divisions had to halt and wait for slow-moving infantry and vital supplies to catch up. In many areas, Germans faced no opposition. In others, Soviet units large and small fought desperately until overwhelmed. The city of Smolensk on the left bank of the upper Dnieper River held out for 63 days. 63 days. Hitler had promised the entire campaign would be over in 5 months. Now, one city was consuming over a month of that timeline, and they weren't even close to Moscow yet. The Russians were fighting back wherever they could, and whenever they could. While German spearheads made spectacular progress toward Leningrad and Moscow, the going was harder on the southern front. Opposition was stiffer there, where 4 Soviet armies held strongly defended positions and compelled invaders to fight bitterly all the way at heavy cost. Again, formations of Soviet tanks, including T-34S, chewed at the panzers, and again Germans had to bring up 88 mm guns to extricate themselves. The T-34S were a shock. Fast, well-armored, mounting a powerful 76 mm gun, they were better than any tank the Germans had. How had intelligence missed this? 11 days after the invasion began, General Halder noted confidently in his diary, I am therefore not exaggerating when I say that the campaign against Russia was won in 14 days. His assurance would prove catastrophically premature. The battles raged on into summer, and the Wehrmacht had to ward off vigorous Soviet counterattacks that shouldn't have been possible if the structure was as rotten as Hitler claimed. Bach in the center executed a giant pincer movement, which converged on Minsk early in July. 300,000 prisoners were taken. A week later came the Battle of Smolensk, which raged for 3 weeks and brought 300,000 more prisoners. The numbers were staggering. Hitler's armies were achieving encirclements on a scale never before seen in warfare. But Bach's armies had suffered such losses that they had to refit and regroup. This wasn't supposed to happen. Victories weren't supposed to cost this much. In August, Hitler and his stunted propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, admitted something shocking. They had obviously underestimated completely Soviet striking power and, above all, the equipment of the Soviet Union. This was a stunning reversal from Hitler's promises about rotten structures collapsing. They were forced to realize that Stalin's regime had succeeded in creating an untouchable Eastern industrial base, which enabled his armies to make good their heavy materiel losses in the battles of encirclement. Despite continuing severe losses of manpower, materiel, and terrain, the Red Army was defending stubbornly and with mounting skill. It was able to prevent rapid German conquest of Leningrad, Moscow, and the industrial region in the Donets Basin. Following an appeal from Stalin, partisan groups were hampering German logistical lines in the hinterland. The Germans were also experiencing supply problems because they'd failed to provide sufficient materiel and transport for lengthy operations. The Russians, soldiers and guerrillas alike, were upsetting the German timetable. The Red Army had not cracked up after its initial setbacks. It was contradicting Hitler's prediction about the whole rotten structure collapsing. Hitler was unaware of the Russians' endurance and indifference to pain and death. A French writer named Jean Breuer Vercours had suggested that Hitler's legions would go through the country like a knife into butter. His Russian friend Leon Moltchany retorted, "What an idea. You don't know the Russians. Never mind if they like or dislike Stalin and his regime. That doesn't count anymore. Holy Russia is attacked, and they'll defend it, to the last man, and they're invincible. Hitler has repeated Napoleon's mistake. Even if he gets away with some early successes, he has flung himself into a bottomless pit. He's doomed." Stalin, alarmed at the loss of several of his armies, appointed himself Commissar of Defense and took direct control of operations. He set up a general headquarters, the Stavka, and relied on dependable senior officers to take charge of crisis situations. The Generalissimo was as brutal with the army as he'd been with his people during the infamous purges of the 1930s. Many of the generals who'd faced the initial German blitzkrieg were relieved and executed, shot for failure, their families punished. The message was clear: win or die. Those who remained were hard and ruthless, obeying orders no matter the cost in casualties. Stalin ordered that troops were to fight to the last man, and that families of those who surrendered would be deprived of all their rights. Soldiers who fled from the battlefield were quickly shot by their own side. The harsh measures worked, steeling Soviet defenders in their determination to kill Germans. The Russians, led by tough generals like Semen Timoshenko, Simen Budeny, Konstantin Rokossovsky, Ivan Konev, and Vasily Chuikov, matched the highly disciplined German troops in merciless resolve. Seldom was such total disregard for the Geneva Conventions and rules of war witnessed in World War II. From Leningrad all the way to Berlin, the Russo-German War would be a fight to the death with no quarter asked or given. When Halder became aware of the Soviet Army's growing strength, effectiveness, and will, the formerly confident general was obliged to change his views. On August 11th, he made an entry in his diary that contradicted everything he'd believed 6 weeks earlier. "Overall," he wrote, "it is clearer and clearer that we have underestimated the Russian colossus, which had prepared itself for war with an utter lack of restraint characteristic of the totalitarian state. This is as true in the area of organization as it is of the economy, the area of transport and communications, but above all, to pure military power. At the start of the war, we reckoned on some 200 enemy divisions. Now we have already counted 360. These divisions are definitely not armed and equipped in our sense, and tactically they are in many ways badly led, but they are there. 360 divisions. German intelligence had estimated 200. The error was stunning. How do you fight an enemy who fields 80% more divisions than you planned for? How do you destroy an army that keeps producing new divisions faster than you can kill the old ones? While the Red Army suffered many defeats, it was still able to absorb enormous losses in men and materiel, to regroup and to advance. General Hasso von Manteuffel, able commander of the German LVI Panzer Corps, and later the 11th Army, reported something that Western military minds found hard to grasp. The advance of a Russian army is something that Westerners can't imagine. Behind the tank spearheads rolls on a vast horde, largely mounted on horses. The soldier carries a sack on his back, with dry crusts of bread and raw vegetables collected on the march from fields and villages. The horses eat the straw from house roofs. They get little else. The Russians are accustomed to carry on for as long as 3 weeks in this primitive way when advancing. You can't stop them, like an ordinary army, by cutting their communications, for you rarely find any supply columns to strike. Hitler and his advisors had naively expected their armies to be welcomed as liberators by Russians repressed under Stalin's chilling regime. But Germans actually came as conquerors and made little or no attempt to win hearts and minds of the people. They regarded the Slavic population as Untermenschen, subhuman, and were determined to enslave them and exterminate all Jews. Instead of liberating, German troops and attached SS death squads slaughtered hundreds of thousands of soldiers, activists, political rebels, and Jews. They left others to starve and diverted captured resources to Germany. Ukrainian and Belarusian civilians who might have welcomed Germans as liberators instead faced slavery, starvation, and mass murder. From the beginning, the war on the Eastern Front was an ideological struggle, waged with a cruelty not witnessed in Europe since the Mongol scourges of the 13th and 14th centuries. The fighting raged through summer. Despite increasing setbacks as the Red Army grew in both size and effectiveness, German military professionalism excelled. In the first 6 months of the Great Campaign, the Wehrmacht achieved a dozen encirclements of Russian concentrations, ranking with the victories at Sedan in 1871 and the Ardennes in 1940. In the north, Lieb's army pushed through Estonia in August, but was repulsed before Leningrad in September. In the south, armies of Bock and Rundstedt closed pincers at Lokwitza, 120 miles east of Kiev, on September 14th. The German bag was almost 700,000 prisoners, and Hitler called it the greatest battle in the history of the world. He wasn't wrong about the scale. The encirclement of Kiev was probably the greatest German feat of arms in any war, but the Soviets would not give up pressure, and German problems mounted. In August, their advance had been slowed from 20 miles a day to 5 miles a day. German units were overreaching their supply lines, while a series of sharp Soviet counterattacks stalled their advance. Enemy forces were also continually hampered by the thousands of prisoners they'd taken, and for whom there was not sufficient food and shelter. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners starved to death in German hands because the logistics couldn't support them. It became obvious to Hitler's generals that the campaign could not be maintained on 3 fronts simultaneously. Resources were diverted from Army Group Center and the drive toward Moscow to press attacks on Leningrad in the far north and Kiev and Ukraine to the south. This allowed Army Group South to approach the Soviet capital from behind. It was sound tactics, but it cost time, and time was the one resource Hitler couldn't afford to waste. Winter was coming. Despite increasing Russian pressure, Germans pushed on, and managed to get enough supplies rushed forward to renew their drives. They encircled Kiev in late September and Bryansk-Vyazma in October. Almost 8 Soviet armies totaling 1.2 million men were captured. The envelopment of Kiev was probably the greatest German feat of arms in any war. The scale of these victories was unprecedented. Further advances and spectacular gains followed. Manstein got as far as Sevastopol. Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist's crack Panzer Group reached Rostov. Rundstedt's army occupied the general Taganrog-Kharkov-Kursk line. Bok set off from Smolensk early in October and trapped another 600,000 Russians between Vyazma and Bryansk. Bok's spearhead units would eventually reach Klen, only 35 miles west of Moscow, on December 5th. German officers could see the city's gleaming spires through their field glasses. Moscow seemed within reach. Hitler was already busily drafting plans for the destruction of the Soviet capital. But the weather intervened to further hobble German progress. This was what Russians called Rasputitsa, the time when roads dissolve. Heavy rains in October turned dusty roads into impassable rivers of mud. Tanks bogged down to their turrets. Supply columns sank to their axles. Already strained, the German logistical situation was now critical, while the weather favored the Soviets, who knew how to operate in these conditions. Germans had made great progress against stubborn Soviet troops. Despite many unexpected setbacks and heavy losses in men and materiel, invaders had bagged an estimated total of 2 million Russians. Reich press chief Otto Dietrich caused a sensation on October 8th when he announced that Soviet Russia was finished as a military power and that the war in the East was over. Yet, none of the basic aims Hitler had laid down for Barbarossa were achieved. Although his armies had scored huge successes on northern and southern fronts, they had not captured Moscow, Leningrad, the rich Caucasian oil fields, or the Archangel Railway. Above all, Russian armies as a whole had not been destroyed nor prevented from withdrawing when necessary. The diversity of these objectives and the sheer width of front were proving beyond the reach of Operation Barbarossa. Early in November, frosts solidified the muddy roads and enabled the German advance to continue. Kleist's panzers approached Rostov. The 11th Army under Manstein pushed into the Crimea, driving Russians back on Sevastopol. German forces also overran the new industrial city of Kharkov and the Donbas region, the Soviet Union's economic powerhouse. But Hitler's armies were running out of supplies and replacements. Many of the panzer groups were now under strength. Yet Germans, like Russians, would not yield. Once again, they managed to push the Red Army back. Panzer units reached within 18 miles of Moscow. German officers could see the city's gleaming spires through their field glasses, could imagine the victory parade through Red Square. But seeing Moscow and taking Moscow were two different things. The Red Army scored its first major successes in November. It secured the road over Lake Ladoga, the vital supply line to besieged Leningrad. It recaptured Rostov in the south. Meanwhile, the afflictions besetting enemy armies became known to Stalin and his generals, who sensed that their foes were stretched to the breaking point with serious supply problems and lack of winter equipment. The German offensive came to a standstill by the end of November. General Eduard Wagner, the Wehrmacht quartermaster general, reported something chilling. "We are at the end of our personnel and materiel strength." This was an admission no German officer wanted to make. The finest army in the world, the force that had conquered Europe, was running on empty within sight of Moscow. The lull in fighting enabled Russians to bring in more armored divisions from the Manchurian frontier. Stalin, who had long since regained his confidence, ordered the traditional Moscow parade marking the anniversary of the Russian Revolution on November 7th. It was an act of defiance and calculated psychological warfare. Army tank, artillery, and infantry units marched through Red Square and straight out to the front lines. At that time, German reconnaissance patrols were approaching outlying stations of the Moscow subway system. The symbolism was not lost on either side. Launched by Bok on September 30th, Operation Typhoon, the advance on Moscow, was underway. But the weather again brought problems for Germans. Winter came, snow fell. Temperatures plummeted to a daily average of 12 degrees below zero and sometimes 40 below. Guns jammed because their oils were not viscous in such weather. Fires had to be lighted under oil pans of tanks each morning just to get engines started. Without adequate winter clothing, soldiers froze. More than 100,000 cases of frostbite would be reported in December alone. 100,000 German soldiers losing fingers, toes, hands, feet to the cold. Men who'd conquered Europe were now fighting a battle they had no equipment to win. Hitler's planning had not included winter uniforms because the campaign was supposed to be over by now. The Russians were well aware of the German threat to their capital. Unlike 1812, when Napoleon was allowed to enter Moscow, Stalin was determined to defend it. He'd appointed his main troubleshooter, the highly regarded Marshal Georgy Zhukov, to organize the defense with his newly created West Front. Zhukov oversaw the transfer of troop reinforcements from elsewhere, the digging of anti-tank ditches west of the city, and the construction of a formidable series of defense lines by Moscow citizens, including thousands of women. Think about that. While German soldiers approached the city, Moscow women were out in the freezing cold, digging anti-tank ditches with picks and shovels, building defense lines with their bare hands. Zhukov had about 80 divisions, many of them from Siberia, deployed to defend the city. Many Muscovites panicked and fled. Some government agencies were moved behind the Ural Mountains, but Stalin remained in the capital, and that decision steadied the city's nerve. Despite the bitter cold and critical supply problems, disciplined Germans pushed on again toward Moscow, but the Soviets were waiting for them in great strength. On December 5th and 6th, the Red Army launched a surprise counterattack north and south of the capital, breaking through weak German lines and creating large gaps in the front. It appeared that several German formations might become encircled, and they fell back. There was no hope of drawing reserves from another theater of operations. Soviet troops kept up the attacks across a front of almost 600 miles for 34 days. Germans were forced back 50 to 150 miles. It was a great victory for the Soviet army, a heartening moment for the hard-pressed Russian people, and one of the defining battles of World War II. The myth of German invincibility was shattered outside Moscow's gates. German commanders at the front demanded several times that their exhausted troops be withdrawn. An angry Hitler refused. The fanatical Nazi leader ordered that soldiers should die where they stood, and not an inch of ground was to be surrendered. But on December 8th, he agreed reluctantly to issue Directive No. 39, suspending Operation Typhoon for the duration of winter. Army Group Center began pulling back to less exposed positions farther west, and Hitler's anger increased. Several commanders-in-chief and generals were replaced or dismissed. On December 19th, Hitler took over Field Marshal Brauchitz's function as Army Commander-in-Chief. That day, the Führer issued a general order. Every man must fight where he stands, no falling back where there are no prepared positions in rear. But the dispirited, frost-bitten troops were falling back anyway, and Hitler was forced to realize that his Russian adventure had failed. I have to pause here, because this is where Hitler's blunder becomes murder. 100,000 German soldiers suffering frostbite in December alone, men losing fingers, toes, hands, feet, because Hitler refused to provide winter clothing or allow withdrawal. These weren't Nazi ideologues dying for the cause. These were conscripts, young men from German villages and cities, freezing to death because their leader's pride wouldn't accept reality. They could see Moscow's spires through binoculars, but couldn't advance another meter. Their bodies were shutting down from cold, while Hitler ordered them to stand and die where they were. If you were a German officer watching your men freeze, their blackened fingers falling off from frostbite, knowing withdrawal could save them, knowing Hitler ordered you to stay, would you obey? Would you sacrifice your men for a leader's delusion, or would you save who you could and face the firing squad? Drop your thoughts below, because this is where military discipline meets moral responsibility, and there's no clean answer. Here's what made it worse. Hitler now had wider concerns. The disaster before the gates of Moscow had been preceded by the December 7th Pearl Harbor attack and the entry of the United States into the war. When the Eastern Front lines stabilized at the end of the month, Germany faced three major enemies: the British Empire, Russia, and America. After many spectacular early successes, Hitler was now engaged in a total war he could not win. Even he must have known it, though he'd never admit it. By the end of December 1941, the Red Army had finally eliminated the German threat to Moscow, shattering the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility. Weakened by heavy personnel and materiel losses from which they never recovered, German armies held defensive positions through the winter of 1941-42, while Hitler became increasingly scornful of the competence of his field commanders. Blame everyone but himself. Classic dictator move. The Red Army had also suffered heavily. By the end of 1941, a total of 3.35 million Soviet troops had been taken prisoner. But the USSR, with a vast reservoir of manpower, did not collapse militarily as predicted. The epic defense of Moscow stiffened Russian morale and proved that the Red Army could not only survive German assault but push back. Hitler's offensive against the city ended in debacle because of dogged and numerically superior Soviet troops, natural obstacles, general winter, and the breakdown of the German supply network. None of the planned operational objectives was attained, and the blitzkrieg strategy was refuted. Quick war doctrine, the cornerstone of German military planning, was destroyed on the frozen ground outside Moscow. Marshal Zhukov reported after the battle, "In planning a large, difficult strategical operation on the scale of Operation Typhoon, the German High Command greatly underestimated the strength, the fighting spirit, and the potential of the Soviet Army in the battle for Moscow. On the other hand, it grossly overestimated the potential of its own troops, who broke through our defensive lines and were supposed to capture the capital of Moscow." It was a devastating assessment, and every word was true. The battle cost Germans more than 500,000 men, 1,300 tanks, 2,500 artillery pieces, and more than 15,000 vehicles. By January 31, 1942, Operation Barbarossa had cost the German armies 918,000 men, killed, wounded, captured, and missing. 918,000. Let that number sink in. Nearly 1 million German casualties, and they hadn't achieved a single strategic objective Hitler had outlined. After the Battle of Moscow, German armies conducted a slow retreat in desperate conditions. Soviet attacks threatened to envelop them in a defeat as disastrous as that which overtook Napoleon's Grand Army in 1812. But Russians overreached, and enemy forces were able to restore a semblance of order to the front. The spring thaw in March 1942 brought operations to a halt. Then, after new offensives were mounted, fierce battles raged at Kalinin, Orel, the River Don, Krasnodar, Stalingrad, Kursk, Lvov, and elsewhere across the vast Eastern Front for almost 3 more years. Growing stronger and stronger, the Red Army relentlessly pushed Germans back all the way to Warsaw, Budapest, East Prussia, Vienna, and Berlin. The road from the gates of Moscow led inevitably to the Reichstag's ruins. If you've made it this far, thank you for following this story of hubris and catastrophic miscalculation. This channel isn't about celebrating victories or glorifying warfare. It's about understanding why decisions get made, what they cost the human beings who execute them, and what lessons we can still learn. Operation Barbarossa was Hitler's greatest blunder because he ignored every warning sign, underestimated the enemy, overestimated his own strength, and sacrificed nearly 1 million men for objectives he never achieved. The German soldiers who froze outside Moscow, the Soviet civilians slaughtered by SS death squads, the 3.35 million Soviet prisoners who died in German hands, the families on both sides who lost everything. They all paid for one man's catastrophic miscalculation. I bring you these stories every day because understanding how great disasters happen matters. Understanding how confidence becomes delusion, how ideology blinds you to reality, how ignoring history's lessons gets people killed. That matters. Hit subscribe for daily World War II stories that honor human truth over propaganda, that examine the gap between what leaders promise and what soldiers actually face. Here's the question that haunts me about Barbarossa. Was it doomed from the start, or could different decisions have changed the outcome? If Hitler had attacked in May instead of late June, would those extra weeks have made the difference before winter? If he'd provided winter clothing, would his armies have taken Moscow? If Germans had treated Soviet citizens as liberators instead of subhuman slaves, might the population have welcomed them and Stalin's regime collapsed? Or was the whole enterprise fundamentally impossible? Napoleon's mistake repeated because the Russian winter, Russian distances, and Russian determination always win in the end. Drop your honest analysis below. I'm not looking for what you think you're supposed to say. I want to know what you actually believe about whether Barbarossa could ever have succeeded, or if Hitler kicked open a door that led straight to hell. In the end, Hitler's misguided Operation Barbarossa achieved nothing except to break the back of the German army. That's the legacy, not the spectacular encirclements, not the millions of prisoners, not the 400-mile advances in 3 weeks. The legacy is 918,000 German casualties by January 1942 and 3 more years of grinding retreat all the way to Berlin. Halder's diary entry from June 1941 mocks him now. The campaign against Russia was won in 14 days. He believed it when he wrote it. Professional soldier, educated man, experienced general. And he believed Hitler's promise about rotten structures collapsing. By December, Halder knew the truth. By the end of 1942, he'd be dismissed. By 1944, he'd be arrested for suspected involvement in the plot to kill Hitler. The general who thought Russia would fall in 2 weeks eventually understood that Hitler was Germany's real enemy. The German army never recovered from Barbarossa. They'd fight with skill and courage for 3 more years, winning tactical victories, conducting brilliant defensive operations, making the Soviets pay for every mile. But the strategic situation was hopeless from December 1941 onward. 918,000 casualties, 3 major enemies, objectives unachieved, winter unpreparedness, supply lines overextended, and an enemy who could absorb losses and keep producing new divisions. Stalin's brutal measures worked, executing generals who failed, shooting deserters, punishing families of prisoners. It was monstrous, but it hardened the Red Army into a force that matched German ruthlessness and exceeded German determination. The Soviets learned to fight the Germans, learned to use their advantages in space and manpower, learned that they could trade 10 Soviet soldiers for 1 German and still win because they had more soldiers. The alternative history haunts you. What if Germans had come as liberators? What if they'd treated Ukrainians and Belarusians as fellow humans instead of Untermenschen? Millions of Soviet citizens hated Stalin's regime, had suffered through the purges and famines, might have welcomed a change. But German racial ideology made that impossible. Hitler's contempt for Slavs turned potential allies into mortal enemies and guaranteed that the population would fight to the death. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war was another catastrophic failure. 3.35 million captured by the end of 1941, and most of them died in German hands from starvation, exposure, and deliberate neglect. Germany had a massive potential labor force and a propaganda opportunity. Soviet soldiers treated well might have convinced others to surrender. Instead, word spread about German brutality, and Soviet soldiers fought harder because they knew surrender meant death anyway. Every German miscalculation compounded every other miscalculation, underestimating Soviet divisions, not providing winter clothing, treating population as slaves, murdering prisoners, overextending supply lines, dividing forces between 3 objectives. Each mistake alone might have been survivable. Together, they were catastrophic. Napoleon's disaster in 1812 should have taught the lesson. Russian space, Russian winter, Russian determination, they always win against invaders. But Hitler convinced himself that modern technology and German superiority would produce a different result. He was wrong. The frozen corpses outside Moscow in December 1941 learned the same lesson Napoleon's frozen corpses learned in 1812. The German soldiers who fought in Barbarossa were, by and large, not ideological fanatics. They were conscripts doing their duty, professional soldiers following orders, young men told they were defending Germany against Bolshevism. Many of them had doubts about the invasion, Most of them recognized the logistical problems, but they went anyway because that's what soldiers do. They followed Halder and Bock and Rundstedt into Russia, and 918,000 of them never came home or came home broken. The Soviet soldiers who defended their country paid an even higher price. Millions killed, millions captured, cities destroyed, population enslaved. But they held. Through all the defeats and encirclements and catastrophic losses, they held. Stalin's brutality, Russian patriotism, German cruelty, winter weather, vast distances, all of it combined to create a defense that Hitler couldn't break. After Barbarossa, everything else was inevitable. Stalingrad, Kursk, the long retreat, those were just consequences of the decision made in December 1940, when Hitler issued Directive 21. The moment he ordered the invasion of Russia, he guaranteed Germany's defeat. It just took 4 more years for that defeat to become complete. The Battle of Moscow in December 1941 was the turning point, not just for the Eastern Front, but for the entire war. With Moscow saved, the Soviet Union survived. With the Soviet Union surviving, Germany faced a 2-front war that became a 3-front war after Pearl Harbor. With 3 major enemies and the German army broken outside Moscow, Hitler's defeat was just a matter of time. The soldiers freezing outside Moscow in December 1941 didn't know they'd already lost the war. They still hoped for spring offensives, for victory, for survival. But the generals knew. Halder knew. Even Hitler must have known, somewhere beneath the delusions and ideology, that he'd made the mistake that would cost him everything. 3.5 million men launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, the largest invasion in history. 9 months later, 918,000 of them were casualties. 3 years after that, Soviet tanks would be in Berlin, and Hitler would be dead by his own hand in a bunker, and Germany would be occupied by the 3 enemies he'd made through his own catastrophic decisions. Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's great blunder. The invasion that was supposed to take 5 months took 4 years and ended in Berlin instead of Moscow. The rotten structure that was supposed to collapse held firm and pushed back all the way to the Reichstag. The quick war became total war, and total war consumed the German army that started it. Halder's diary from June 1941 remains as testimony to how completely Hitler and his generals misunderstood what they were attempting. The campaign against Russia was won in 14 days. Those words echo across 80 years as a warning about confidence without foundation, about ideology blinding you to reality, about the price of ignoring history's lessons. Napoleon marched on Moscow. Hitler marched on Moscow. Both learned that some doors, when kicked, kick back hard enough to destroy you.